For centuries, supersessionist assumptions in higher education led generations of academics to assume that Jesus came to abolish the Mosaic Law, the Torah. Today, a new generation of professors and researchers is producing rigorous, meticulously cited work arguing for a different perspective, that Jesus kept the Torah, valued the Torah, and instructed his disciples to keep the Torah and keep practicing Judaism. We're joined today by Dr. Logan Williams and Dr. Paul Sloan, who have recently inaugurated a podcast of their own called Jesus and Jewish Law, where they demonstrate how their research has led them to this pro-Torah view of Jesus.
Put your hand in mine together. We will walk in harmony. Let me introduce you to my teacher, the rabbi from the Galilee.
You're listening to Messiah Podcast, where Jesus is Jewish, and that changes everything. Messiah Podcast is a production of First Fruits of Zion. Create a free account at ffoz.org to start exploring the Jewish foundation of your faith today, and you'll receive a free resource from our store. They're the creators and presenters of the hot new podcast, Jesus and Jewish Law. From Aberdeen, it's Dr. Logan Williams, and from Houston, it's Dr. Paul Sloan. Welcome to Messiah Podcast, you guys.
Thanks for having us.
It's great to be here.
Yeah. Oh, it's good to have you. It's good to have more podcasts out there that I feel there's a lot of confluence here. I feel like there's a similar perspective as far as Jesus' relationship with the Jewish law. And it's always nice when PhDs are talking about this stuff, because you guys are rigorous thinkers and you understand the Koine grammar and all. You have a lot of tools, so it's always fascinating for me and helpful for me to get that perspective. But I want to zoom out a little bit before we get into the details, because I read a lot, but because I'm not in dialogue with a lot of academics, I don't have a really good idea as to the answer to this question. So almost just for my personal curiosity, but also sort of as an establishing shot for the episode today, is there currently in 2025 a mainstream view of Jesus' relationship to the Jewish law, or are there like several different camps, several different ideas floating around that in the academic world people are finding more or less plausible?
Paul, I'll give you the first shot on that.
Okay. I've just written a book. I think he's giving me the first shot because I've just written a book called Jesus and the Law of Moses. It'll be out with Baker Academic in August of this year. And so I've been kind of looking into this a bit, particularly in terms of secondary scholarship. So I think my first stab would say, in the academy, I think there is, in the guild, so Biblical Studies Guild, I would say there's a view that yes, Jesus is doing, is not anti-law, is interpreting law, and is getting into disputes with the Pharisees or contemporaries over sort of intramural, proper keeping of it, intramural, debates about it. But even within the guild, there's going to be outliers who say, no, this is, the Gospels really present him as, doing something else. He's coming to nullify the purity rituals or something else because something new's on the horizon. Outside the guild, there's definitely no mainstream view. Outside the guild, once you're into just the world of, I'm Baptist, and within that world, very, very common, just to hear, Jesus fulfilled the law so that you don't have to, sort of idea, and move in, and it was sort of a doing of it that then it gets sort of imputed to you, and so that now we can appreciate intellectually the debates that he was having with the Pharisees, but they're irrelevant. And his instruction in Torah is effectively irrelevant for sort of discipleship, is, I'd say, a standard view that I've come across. Logan, I don't know what you'd add to that.
Yeah. I think there's also, there are all these people who think that Jesus is just kind of doing away with a bunch of Torah stuff. Then there's a lot of other people who also think like, no, he's, you hear a lot. I mean, for decades, we've been having books published from scholars that say, Jesus was a Torah observant Jew.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes what that means is not filled out, but even for some people who do say that, they would even sometimes say like, well, he's a Torah observant Jew, but he's observant to the true intent of the Torah.
Yeah.
Which is kind of like not actually doing what it says.
Yeah.
The way I like to portray it is like God is this divine gaslighter who like gives you a bunch of laws, but then like doesn't really want you to obey them as he's specified. And so it's kind of like this game that you have to figure out what they're really about. And Jesus kind of figured out what it's really about. Like, he says don't work and don't light fires on Shabbat, but like he didn't really mean that. So Jesus is teaching them what it was really about, which like is a view they would say, those scholars would say like, no, I think Jesus was Torah observant, but what that means, I think whether that's a legitimate description of what their view is, I think could be legitimately disputed. But yeah, I would say in popular discourse in my circles, in my experience at the Church of England, as well as the Scottish Episcopal Church now in Aberdeen, the Torah is just kind of the meanie.
Yeah.
It's the thing that
it's the hurdle
is representative of all the things I don't like in modern society. So if the thing that I don't like is that certain groups are marginalized, then what the Torah and Judaism was doing was marginalizing people, and Jesus came to include people.
Interesting.
So it kind of plays the kind of whatever political bad guy I don't like. Mm-hmm. That's not all subsectors of the Church of England and Scottish Episcopal Church, but in a lot of the circles that I have been in, that's a lot of what I've heard over the last 10 or so years of living in the United Kingdom.
That's interesting. Yeah, sort of keeping the basic tension and conflict that of this idea that Jesus came to abolish the law, but then reframing it or redefining it so that it's reflective of a post-colonial value system, and that's retrospective or dealing with recriminations of history. And wow, it sounds fascinating, but it's quite far afield from what I would consider like biblical studies. Like I'm all about what were they talking about at that time? Like how would someone in Jesus' time have understood him? Not to say that it couldn't have a depth of meaning beyond that.
Yeah.
When God is talking, he might be saying a couple different things for sure.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond the scope of maybe our discussion today.
Yeah.
On the map of different academic opinions of Jesus' relationship to Judaism and the Jewish law, where did the two of you fall? Would you articulate your axioms or your premises as far as this goes? Like from what angle are you approaching this topic on your podcast? Part
of what we're doing is also positioning ourselves against some typical views. So you got a typical view that Jesus is critiquing legalism, sort of works righteousness, the notion that, okay, Jews were trying to earn their salvation, but now Jesus is here to show you something else that is irrespective or independent of Torah observance. Or some people would say that, okay, the law inscribed a sort of nationalism, and the Pharisees of Jesus' day were especially like violently nationalistic, but Jesus was inclusive of all nations. Therefore, the law that inscribed their nationhood needed to be set aside as redundant because Israel's distinctiveness is falling away, that sort of idea. Or another group is the idea that has said, purity regulations inscribe merciless exclusivity, right? The notion that like if you're purity rituals stratified society.
Yeah.
And so against that, Jesus is, again, egalitarian and inclusive. So therefore, because of that, he had to set aside the purity rituals, that sort of idea. We're positioning ourselves against those things and then positively saying restoration eschatology is a major feature of what we're doing. The notion that the Gospels are presenting Jesus as the herald and executor of Israel's national restoration, and that basic to that is also an instruction of the proper keeping of Torah for the age of restoration and before, and that then Jesus is teaching Torah, and then any disputes he has are disputes over either interpretation or over something related to his own identity. Logan, sorry, I don't know if you want to add. I kind of gave a pretty full answer, but I don't know what you want to
Maybe to your surprise, I actually do have something to say. I think in general, what we are, at least the approach that I tried to bring. I mean, we both script the episodes together, so sometimes like our different emphases come out at different times, and sometimes I end up saying things that Paul has written, and vice versa, and whatever. So we never really know who is emphasizing what. For me, you know, like we're both on board with this, that we're trying to show that it's not as simple as just saying Jesus was Torah observant, because in the first century, what it meant to be Torah observant was a huge point of disagreement amongst many Jews, which is why you have Essenes and Sadducees and Pharisees and Zealots and Amei Haaretz and, you know, all these different kinds of groups who think that what it means to, who think different things about what it means to rest, or what it means to not work, or what it means to obey the Sabbath commandment, or how to deal with difficult halakhic situation, or difficult halakhic questions, or legal situations, or stuff like that. I mean, if you just open up a single page of the Mishnah, you see all this. Rabbi Yossi says this, Rabbi Huda says this, you know, sages say this, and who knows who's right? Or at least, you know, sometimes the Mishnah doesn't answer. That's what I mean. But so for us, it's, you know, we try to show that you can see that what the gospel writers are doing and what Jesus is doing is portraying Jesus and his family and some of those around him as Torah observant, but that they also have a particular perspective on what Torah observance entails, and that might not have been agreed upon by everyone. So what we did, for example, in the last episode is we said, well, there are some disagreements about, you know, how far can a Zav go into Jerusalem? Can he be in the outskirts of the city? Can he be inside the wall but not on the Temple Mount? Or does he have to be excluded from the whole city altogether? And we can say, this is a debate. It's not clear where the gospel writers fall, but those were the kind of things on offer. But then sometimes we do see that Jesus falls within a certain camp or in none of those camps. But you can see that he has a certain perspective on, for example, what it means to obey Shabbat, or something like that. So we're trying to show that, like, it's not like he's just the same as everyone else, which is what I think when people say, like, Jesus was a Torah observant Jew, I'm like, well, yeah, but lots of other people thought that he wasn't Torah observant. And how do we interpret that? Do we just therefore say that means that he was chucking out Torah? Probably not. As historians, we should say he had a different perspective on what it meant to obey Torah, because he portrays himself as doing so. So where the interesting points lie is, why does he think that he's Torah observant? Why does he think his opponents, such as the scribes and Pharisees, are not Torah observant? And why do they think otherwise? Why do they think they're Torah observant? He's not. And trying to explain those debates and not understand that, or, you know, to try and push that, we do that in order to try and push back on the notion that these debates are about the validity of Torah.
Yeah.
The fact that those discussions are happening are in fact indicative of a shared assumption that they both agree that Israel should be obeying Torah, but they disagree on what that should look like.
Yeah, and just to add, I think so. I obviously agree with all that. That was really excellently put. And I think what we really want our listeners to understand as well is that how Torah might be interpreted is not obvious. It doesn't lead to inevitable conclusions, right? When you read the law, and you might read a commandment and you might think, okay, yeah, this obviously says X, Y, Z. And then you might look at the way it was interpreted in Philo, Josephus, Mishnah, whatever, and you're like, oh gosh, that's not at all what I thought the obvious reading was, you know? And yet it seems to have been pretty widely accepted. So that there might be a widely accepted interpretation in the first century that doesn't seem obvious to a modern reader just flipping it open and reading in English or even Hebrew. And yet there it is. And so then you can kind of work and try to figure out how they got there and what other passages they were reading in conjunction with it, et cetera. But the point is to say that just as Logan just said, like when you get Jesus, then, you know, enacting his Torah observance or teaching about it, and then you see that it, say, disagrees with the Pharisees or whatever, it doesn't mean that he's against, it certainly doesn't mean he's against the validity of the Torah, but even then it might not indicate that he's against all Pharisaic observances or instruction or conclusions. It just means that on this particular issue, he's different, right? So you can see overlap in his rulings on marriage and divorce. You can see the line in Matthew 23 where he tells people to do as the scribes and Pharisees have said, whatever that passage means. I'm actually not sure.
Yeah.
But the point is that it's a disagreement with the Pharisees isn't a disagreement with Pharisaism, as if that were some sort of monolithic first century reality.
Well, yeah, the Jewish sources portray Pharisaism in Jesus' time as being quite divided. You had this big event where the disciples of Shammai take over the house of study, and I think they kill a bunch of people and enact a bunch of prohibitions. And there's variety. We can say at least there's variety within Pharisaism. So I think sometimes maybe it's those Pharisees he's talking to at that moment, even, and not just disagreeing with all Pharisees.
Right.
I think of the example, like when he talks about, you guys say that if someone dedicates all of his property as korban because he doesn't want it to benefit his father or mother and he regrets it later, you don't release him from his vow. And the Mishnah records that opinion, but it also records the opinion that he can be released from his vow. And like, that's the last one that's listed. So it's like, that's the one that person had the last word. It's like, he's part of a discussion, right? He's part of an argument. He took one side of it, maybe an extant argument.
Yeah, right. That's 9:1, where Eliezer says, yes, we release someone on a vow because of father and mother, the sages prohibit. And then it records a view by Art Zadok. And then all of a sudden the sages agree with Rabbi Eliezer. and it doesn't explain why they agree. But apparently something about either the bad argument of Rabbi Zadok or maybe the good argument of Rabbi Eliezer convinced them. But yeah.
Yeah. I just found that when I first read that in the Mishnah, it blew my mind. I thought, it came around. It's a conversation. It's a conversation. So you talked about, but you've each talked about sort of your context, your academic context over there in Scotland and in Houston, and how you perceive that there are many around you who have taken a different view, and you're sort of coming with a challenge to that view, maybe even a prevailing view, particularly with a Baptist one being one I'm more familiar with, but even there in Scotland. So I think an interesting question for me would be, how did each of you personally arrive at what maybe a minority viewpoint in your context?
Yeah, I mean, actually one of the main things that got me into reading a lot of biblical studies in undergrad was confusion that I had about what Protestants would say about the Torah. So I remember I became a Christian when I was a teenager. So I didn't grow up with a lot of the kind of, how do I say this, like really horrific anti-Semitic stereotypes that get pumped into people for all of Sunday school for like the first 10 years of their life. Like I've read some Sunday school material about the Pharisees and like, ooh, like
I learned this song.
I didn't even know about this song until like a few years ago.
No, I knew it as a kid.
Like some of these stereotypes, like I am.
But there's a song.
Oh yeah, there's.
I don't want to be a Pharisee. They're not Pharisee. I don't want to be a Sadducee. Because they deny the reresurrection, so they're so Sadducee. I just want to be a sheep, etc.
Yeah.
There's multiple lines I can't rember, but
I just want to be a sheep.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. It's coming back.
Yeah.
It's coming back.
I tried hard to forget it, so I think successfully have a little bit, but I think that's part of it.
Yeah. So I remember when, like, just people saying stuff like, "Oh yeah, Judaism thinks that you need to earn your way to God before you get saved," and I was like. My freshman year of undergrad, I read like the whole Old Testament for the first time. And I was like, what do you mean? Like they get delivered from Exodus before they get like a single commandment. I mean, like exclude, Genesis 17 and Pesach, sure. But like you get, I'm the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. Don't have any other gods before me. Like the logic is God's graciousness and beneficence first.
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean? Like, the Old Testament is this like system of like works righteousness. Like, I don't understand how you could say that. And that just got me into like digging into a bunch of stuff about ancient Judaism, and I was exposed to a lot of stuff. So that was kind of actually my like initial burning question was about law stuff and ancient Judaism when I was in my undergraduate years. And then during the end of my PhD, I did my PhD on not that topic.
Okay.
I'm more like Greco-Roman philosophy and Paul's letters to the Galatians. But towards the end of my PhD, I started seriously studying the Mishnah with a professor at Durham, who would just walk me through. Well, it was the Mishnah and the Mechilta, and I remember just being
nice.
Like I taught biblical Hebrew at Durham for a few years, but then when I entered this stuff, I was like, I don't know what is going on, and he just took me by the hand and just like started walking me through, and then I like buried myself in the rabbis, and it just started to slowly change the way, slowly but also rapidly, just like in a kind of slow drip way, but very drastically change how I experienced when I would go back and read the New Testament. I would just be like, oh, this is a dispute about this, not about, whether we should obey Shabbat. It's about, how do we deal with conflicting obligations, or how do we, or the questions that we see in Mishnah Yoma or Mishnah Shabbat. Like, it just completely transformed the way that I started to see these things. And what I realized was that a lot of New Testament scholars who work with this stuff are just not familiar with the kind of legal categories and nature of legal discourse, that it leads them to totally misunderstand what's going on. I mean, a classic example that Paul and I wrestle with a lot because we were writing on it is people just talking about like food laws and in general, and they just like lump like kashrut with like Torah and avodah zarah, and they just like lump all those together, and they just go, these are Jewish food laws. Oh, and like whether you can eat sacrifices in the state of purity, like all of these things are very, very distinct, separate kinds of, discourses with their own sets of laws. And just because one of those is at play doesn't mean all of them are at play.
Yeah.
So, when Jesus is disputing whether you need to wash hands, he's not disputing whether you can eat the prohibited animals of Leviticus 11, and he's not disputing either whether you can eat sacrificial meat. And yet, like, what I would see New Testament scholars do is they just totally mix these things.
Yep.
And just after studying kind of the Mishnah on its own terms, not trying to like, I think, right, you're not trying to like extract things from it, or like not trying to like just mine for things that you don't like and things to like, dunk on, which is a classic thing. Like if you just kind of learn it for itself, and you read Mishnah Tosefta, you look at Gemara, you look at other Tanaitic sources like Sifra and Mechilta, whatever, like it just totally transforms, once you immerse yourself in it, it totally transforms how you even hear these things. And just approaching it from that just totally transformed the way I experienced the New Testament, which then motivated me to kind of do the things I do now.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
There'll be overlap here. I mean, I also similarly, I did grow up a Christian and in a Christian house, going to church and everything. But always just had the same sort of similar questions. The typical stuff. I mean, my sort of probably gateway to it was a super, I don't want to call it low level, but like an entry level debate between Paul and James, right? Like I remember that just like in Bible studies.
Oh yeah.
Like, hey, what's Paul? Why do they sound different here? What's going on here? And so that just sort of, I led me to an interest in that sort of thing. Similarly, though, then I didn't do my PhD on any of this, which is funny. I also went into the PhD with a desire to do something related to it, and then just didn't. I wrote on Mark 13, the Olivet Discourse. And then right after that, just started reading. And it was a group of scholars that really pushed me to think carefully and consequently think differently about the law and its interpretation. My actually entry point was actually probably David Moffat because of he was my supervisor, but he was also obviously working on ritual and sacrifice and everything else in Hebrews, which then just through him introduced me to Milgram and Jonathan Klawans and folks who were writing on legal categories broadly, but particularly ritual purity and sacrifice, which then, of course, that just opened the floodgates. Then I started reading just scholars that I have been so helpful and informative. E.P. Sanders, obviously. Actually, not Paul and Palestinian Judaism. As great as that book is, it's great. But his book, Jewish Law from Jesus to the Mishnah, I think is actually his best book. And it was because he just goes through primary text over primary text, and it's just excellent. So scholars and scholarship like that, Yair Furstenberg as well, scholars and scholarship like that pushed me in a similar direction as Logan. And actually, funnily enough, kind of concurrently in the very beginning, independently, but then quite quickly, just through, I think, social media, we kind of realized, hey, we're kind of thinking and talking about some of this stuff similarly. So then that just kind of led to this kind of partnership of sorts of just sort of mutual thinking and talking about all these kinds of issues pretty regularly. And then I couldn't quite tell you what led me to write the book, except my friend Chris Kugler just said, "You're annoying me with all these conversations. You just need to write a book about it instead." So he just emailed somebody, and I got that. That's how that ball got rolling. And so then that's what got me ultimately to begin the writing process. And then the writing process, of course, just led me down all the same kinds of trails that Logan just started to describe. So I won't repeat, but just engaging deeply with Mishnah and Tosefta and of course, first century Jewish sources as well, Philo, Josephus, Dead Sea Scrolls, etc.
Yeah, I think it was around the time I was writing my Mark 7 article that you got a book contract. I think it was around that time. So it kind of coalesced.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it was right then, and we were just started to talk about it, and that's when we were both learning more and more and more about all these different things, ritual purity, but also then like noticing the habit. Logan already mentioned it, but like noticing the habit of New Testament scholars, I should say non-Jewish New Testament scholars, who would then just conflate all these different legal categories. So you'll see someone reading 1 Corinthians 8, which is clearly about food sacrificed to images, and say, "Oh, well, this is of a piece with Romans 14 and Mark 7 and Acts 10, because those are all food laws." And you're like, well, that's literally 4 different legal domains. Mark 7 is about ritual purity. Acts 10 is about the Gentiles, not food. Romans 14 is probably about food sacrifice to images away from an idol's temple. And 1 Corinthians 8 through 10 is about potentially both categories. So you're just like, you're talking about 4 different sort of legal domains here, and people will just lump them into one. So noticing that sort of stuff, and then realizing, oh, we have to really sharpen up here. And so then it just led to, thinking critically and a bit more carefully about some of these things. And the carefulness of it was itself trained by a deep engagement with, the Jewish sources that Logan already mentioned.
Nice. Yeah. One of my top pet peeves is people who form an opinion about whether it's okay to eat food sacrificed to idols, by starting to read 1 Corinthians 8 and not making it to 1 Corinthians 10.
Yep. 10, 14 to 22 should certainly inform
and
your
8's
opinion.
pretty short, so you're really getting like 10% of the whole discourse there.
Right.
Yeah. And one of my other top pet peeves is people who come to a conclusion about Israel's identity as the people of God by starting to read Romans 9 and not finishing Romans 11.
Yep.
You have these times where Paul constructs this elaborate journey for people. And I was just talking about this for a teaching I did. And it's like, if you don't make it to the end, and you stop in the middle, or you just pick out a couple of verses from the middle, like you might pick out a time where Paul is characterizing someone else's argument. He tells you where you're supposed to have arrived if you make it all the way to the end of the passage.
Yeah, that's right.
But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's like rookie mistakes, I think, that people make rather than some kind of serious or technical error. Anyway,
the one that we've both seen quite a bit is the practice of, again, typically non-Jewish New Testament scholars. They've seen a group of texts cited, and so then that same string of text keeps getting cited toward the same conclusion. So you'll see a string of rabbinic references cited as if they all prove X, Y, Z. And then we just kind of made a habit out of really going back to check those and then thinking, this is actually not related at all. It's not. And a few more often than not, we're like, I'm just genuinely surprised at how one could have even potentially reach that conclusion. Like it's not even the same legal domain. It's just not related at all. And so my sense is that oftentimes scholarship will, I shouldn't pontificate on motives, but I'm guessing what is happening is they've seen a reputable scholar cite them, and so that then they just lift those citations and keep using them, and then all of a sudden, 10 years worth of commentaries are citing the same texts, half of which are irrelevant.
Yeah. You know, someone looked up the passage in Strachbiller-Beck, and they
Exactly what I was going to say.
who listed every single time in Jewish literature that a dog is mentioned.
Right.
And it's like picked out the ones that looked like the.
Yeah.
Yep. I do think part of it is like the lack of confidence that some New Testament scholars have with the Jewish sources, so they feel like they have to always defer to the people who they think are much more embedded in them than they think they are, but then they are not capable of evaluating whether the citation of or reference to that source is legitimate. So then these mistakes just keep getting perpetuated.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, then and you have secondary sources citing secondary sources, and you can end up with that's. You know, the first time I read Samuel Sandmel's article on parallelomania, I was like, come on, because I'm always looking for things in the Mishnah or Talmud or wherever that will help, that will shed some light on something that's going on in the New Testament. But now that I'm older, I'm like, people just say, oh, food is mentioned here as well. So it's like, well, food's a big part of life.
Yeah.
Nice. So here's an interesting idea. I just asked Dr. Novenson the same question, Matthew Novenson, who wrote Paul and Judaism at the End of History. And I thought I'd ask you guys too, because there seems to be, and I don't know how prevalent this is, but I get the idea sometimes that in the academic world, there's an idea that, well, if the earliest written example of an idea that we have in Judaism is Gemara or even like Mishnah, well, that post dates the writing of the Gospels by over 100 years. So we can't use that. We can't say that idea was extant or that was a topic of discussion, even if the Mishnah says that it was and says that the personages in the Mishnah would have been alive in Jesus' time or even before. We can't. It wasn't written down until 200. So we can't say that idea was there. So we can't, it's like, we have to exclude that testimony, right? We have to strike it from the record. The jury's not allowed to consider it. I get that idea. Maybe I'm characterizing it in an extreme way, but I think that sometimes people do go that far. Our position is kind of the opposite extreme. Like it's Messianic Judaism is the religion that we espouse. I'm not Jewish, so that's complicated for me. But we see that as sort of like the biblical ideal, and so for us the Masorah is important, and it's like we read the Mishnah, we read Gemara, especially the Jewish people on our staff, as a matter of like faith and halacha. Like it's important. These texts are important. Although we also think it's a reasonable position to say that Yehuda Hanasi didn't come up with a bunch of stuff in circa 200 CE all by himself. Right. But how do you navigate this issue? Like, do you get pushback for bringing in Tosefta and Gemara and Mishnah and Mechilta, like when you are exegeting Jesus, who lived, before these texts were finally redacted? And if so, like, how do you justify the use of these sources in an academic context?
I'll say something brief. Logan will probably be better equipped to answer this one, so I'll just be brief. The one thing I'll say is, yes, it's obviously the case that the composition of it is significantly later than the composition or than the life of the Jesus, but not necessarily actually that much later than the composition of the Gospels when you're only talking about a couple generations. But we also see legal opinions that are being discussed in the Mishnah. We see them, or a version of them, discussed in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so you can see stuff which are, could be 2nd century BC, and to where you've got the rulings about the unity of a stream and its incapacity for impurity to spread up it or down it, or rituals related to the red heifer, or rulings about Shabbat that also then appear as matters of debate in the Mishnah. And on the same grounds and along the same lines, it looks like it's being the same topic is being disputed. And so, while I don't think you can just use all rabbinic material sort of uncritically, particularly at least when I'm talking about interpreting the Gospels, I do think there are occasions when it's possible, easy, maybe even might be too strong a word, but certainly possible to determine, like, okay, this is an opinion that was being debated not only in Jesus' time but 200 years before it, and so this kind of evidence is usable in terms of at least a trajectory, if not the very language of the debate. But Logan will probably have more to say on that.
If we didn't find tefillin from Qumran, the earliest source we would have for the 4 parshot that go on tefillin would be Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael. And then after that, Bavli Menachot 34a. And I bet you a bunch of New Testament scholars today would read that and go, we don't know. We really don't know that goes back. I mean, the exact, you're saying that the Mechilta says these 4 parshot have to be on your tefillin. There's no way that Jews had those exact 4. And then we go back and find tefillin from very early, and we find those exact 4 parshot on the tefillin from Qumran. That is not to say that we just blindly trust everything in rabbinic literature as going back to the 1st century or earlier. But it does mean that we know that there are certain things that we can only know about from this literature. And it requires sifting and critical engagement with these sources. And I think there are just too many instances where it's very clear that something does go back. And I mean, for me, it's one of the things that can help adjudicate that. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into this, but one of them is, if this does go back to the 1st century, does it have explanatory power? So the example, right, the stuff from the Tosefta and stuff from Sifra, which say that anything that goes out below a human person or an animal is pure. We don't have that exact ruling from the 1st century, or something that's not explicitly stated. But that notion brings so much clarity to something like Mark 7 that that is not, there's no way that's a later formulation. Or at least because if we posit that does go back, that's something like that view, not exactly as it's framed in the Tosefta or Sifra, but something like that does go back to the 1st century. Then if we posit that that's a shared assumption between the Pharisees and Jesus in Mark 7, it makes so much sense of the nature of their dispute. There are some things also, I think, in those very same passages that are later. For example, the ruling that when you eat nevela of tahor, the carcass of a pure bird, that it only defiles in your esophagus. I think that's probably a ruling that I think is later than the Pharisees, which is in the same passage as something that says that eating it can't defile you in the stomach. But nonetheless, we have to make these decisions, right? The thing that I put to people is, like, when they say, like, well, are you sure you can use this? I'm like, if we don't use it, we're in the dark and on so much, and maybe we just need to be in the dark. That's fine. But we can see that that there are ways to use it. And so I think as in use just rabbinic literature in general. So I think for me, like the obligation of New Testament scholars, if we're going to be talking about law, we have to be seriously well versed in making these kinds of historical critical decisions about the later literature. Another example is the interpretation of Leviticus 19:5. Don't put a stumbling block before the blind. What is that? 19:5.
Yeah.
Don't put a stumbling block before the blind is interpreted in the Gemara as referring to not facilitating idolatry. Nowhere in Tannaitic sources does that appear.
Wow.
But where else does it appear? The Apostle Paul. So if we didn't have the Pauline epistles, we wouldn't have known that that verse was interpreted specifically as a prohibition against facilitating idolatry. But something from the Gemara clearly preserves a tradition that goes back to the first century. Now that we know we have Paul's letters, so we know that a lot of this stuff goes back. And I think also like some of it is not even about like the value of rabbinic literature does not only lie in what can you use to figure out what goes back to the first century, because
we agree.
It shows the longue durée of the debate. So it's equally as helpful to know where things land as much as it's helpful to know what things go back. So when you were able to trace the development and in things that are legitimate innovations by the rabbis, by the Tanaim or by the late Tanaim or the Amoraim, are really helpful for situating Jesus within this longer, centuries-long, millennia-long conversation about what it means to obey the Torah. And so this is why I emphasize New Testament scholars, like it's like the value of the Mishnah is not just in like picking out what you think goes back. Like you should probably just sit down and just read it for itself and just try to understand it on its own terms before you try to, jump back to see what's like actually relevant, which is a value judgment I would question.
That's a really good point. And I think I definitely agree. Even like you mentioned this earlier, just learning to think in the right categories.
Right.
Like we talk about it as like just opens the eyes. And another thing that you mentioned briefly that you also talk about on the podcast that I really like, because we did something similar. I think our director of education, D. Thomas Lancaster, went through and listed one time the number of times where you look and the actual first manuscript evidence for a Jewish practice is the New Testament.
Yep.
If you just consider the New Testament as Jewish literature, all of a sudden you have, a century or more than a century before the Mishnah is redacted, you have manuscript evidence of, some detail of Pesach Seder, things like that. And,
the naming of the child at the circumcision.
Yep.
Right. I mean, Isaac Oliver mentions this. The first references in something in the Bavli or later even, and I can't remember. But the point is and so then when you see it in Luke 2, the fact that he's named at the circumcision, people are like, oh, this must be some Greco-Roman thing that he's sort of pilfered and is using because he's whatever. You're like, and then Isaac Oliver, I love what he says. He just says, well, if this had been written in Jubilees, a text more obviously considered Jewish by people, would people think the same thing, or would they think, "Oh, here's the first attested practice of it by in the Jewish text"? But then all of a sudden, once you assume Luke Acts just isn't Jewish, well, then you come up with different explanatory hypotheses. But if you just posit, well, it's Jewish, then you're like, well, here's the first attested practice.
I think there's a bunch of other. I mean, like a bunch of other ones you could list. I mean, I think the only literary reference to like a person wearing tzitzit is the Gospels. I mean, I think we have like obviously like people talk about the practice, but like as in I think Philo and Josephus probably will refer to it, but you don't have like a reference to some an actual Israelite wearing them. Is the first reference we have is Mark 6, and then Sosai Psuchen in Mark 3 is the first potential reference we have to the principle of pikuach nefesh. Although I don't think that principle is necessarily operative there in the same way that's for the rabbis. The phrase obviously was in operation in the first century, and Jesus is the first literary person on record to say it. As in, he wouldn't have been the first person to say it, but for which we have evidence. I'm trying to think of other things.
Luke 14
the prayer
here.
of the earth the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. The use of that prayer before as a bracha before meals is first recorded in 1 Corinthians.
Yep.
I mean, the list could go on. Sorry, what was the one you were going to say?
Well,
Luke 14?
just Luke 14. The fact that it's the healing of the man with dropsy or edema, and he's he says, "Who of you wouldn't, if you had an ox or a son fall into a well, who of you wouldn't pull them out? But the point is there it seems to be the man with dropsy does not seem to have a life-threatening condition. And so here it seems to be some sort of active healing to ameliorate a non-life-threatening condition that Jesus thinks is permissible on the Sabbath. And so, okay, this is distinct from the typical ruling you see in Mishnah Shabbat, where it typically rules that you can certainly override Shabbat for preservation of life, but typically in non-life-threatening conditions, you don't. And yet, okay, Jesus is here saying something where it appears to be, permissible to heal on Sabbath, even in non-life-threatening scenarios. But it shows, as Logan mentioned earlier, the continuum, or the fact that this itself is like, just because this is its first attested practice in, say, Luke 14, doesn't mean this is sort of a break from either Judaism or a break from, certain commonly attested practices. It may well be the first attested practice of someone who's arguing for the permissibility of healing on Shabbat for non-life-threatening cases. But once you put the Gospels and other literature in the New Testament in that sort of continuum as Jewish literature, then stuff begins to be potentially the first attested practice of it, rather than some unheard of break or some other context must be being pilfered to understand as well. And yeah, obviously lots of other examples I think could be given, but those are probably good ones.
Yeah, I love that, and I love that. I think Isaac Oliver is just such a great guy to say that, because you need a Jewish person to say that. It hits different than a Gentile saying, "Look, all this stuff is Jewish literature," and it's like, well, like you imagine how Jewish people feel about that, but I have a Jewish guy saying, I think it's Jewish literature.
Yeah, his work is excellent. I think that's valuable. No, his work
Isaac is fantastic.
Yeah, we love his work.
It's fantastic. Yeah,
I have that. It's those cloth bound books, the small printings are expensive. I got a couple of them, and that's one.
Yep.
It's back there on the shelf. Hey, just wanted to take a second here to remind you that when you like, comment, and subscribe, YouTube is more likely to recommend this video to other people. And the more the channel grows, the more of a platform we have to be able to invite other amazing guests like Dr. Sloan and Dr. Williams, giving you the opportunity to hear how the Jewish Jesus is changing lives across the globe. So please smash that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. These small steps have a big impact on spreading the message of the Jewish Jesus and his kingdom to as large an audience as possible. Thanks. So we talked a little bit about the academic side, but you're both people of faith. So I want to ask, how has this perspective, and if so, how has this perspective influenced like your devotion to the master, your walk of faith? Like, and maybe this should be a two-parter, because you're proclaiming this viewpoint on a podcast. So how would you hope that this viewpoint would impact someone else's walk of faith, or maybe even the church as a whole?
Well, I don't eat blood. So that's
same.
That's an easy one to start with.
Very good.
Wait, no, you don't eat meat in the Idolion either. So
that's true. Yep.
Yeah. Not that there's one nearby, or maybe there is. I don't know. Texas is a crazy place,
Yeah.
Yeah, Acts 15. How many people read right over that? We got rules.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
So part of it has to do with just my comfortability. Comfort and my comfort with just the language of law and obedience, etc. Sometimes those are particularly in my expression of Protestantism in the students I deal with, they're just uncomfortable with the language because it sounds like it automatically sounds like it lends itself to works righteousness or something like that. And so
legalism.
Right, exactly. So I've just found that basically just demystifying that and just making it a normal feature of my vocabulary, and meaning that my comfort with just saying things like, we ought to keep Torah, and then obviously that then opens up a different discussion of what I'm obligated to, etc., based on, in my view, Acts 15. But the point is that just that kind of language has just helped me and students, and I hope the people that I'm a teaching pastor as well. Just it once you've removed that hurdle, then people can also remove some of the mental gymnastics they have, because I remember the mental gymnastics that I would experience when I thought, okay, I need to obey this, and then mentally thinking, oh no, am I trying to? Is that doing something bad? Right? Am I trying to impress God? And is that bad? And so lead to this old psychological spiral.
Yeah.
And so I think just that
cognitive dissonance.
Yeah. So I think that helps. Truthfully, actually, people don't believe me when I say this, and it's true. And I think it's also true for Logan. I'll let him speak for himself, but no, I know it to be true of Logan. I just think it's good to read the Bible well. That's a good in and of its own right. I mean, I've often had these talked about a given interpretation of a given passage, either Romans 14 or Mark 7 or whatever. And, the conclusion from a fellow New Testament scholar, sometimes even believers, have been, okay, well, cool, we get it, but who cares? Like, how does it affect me? I'm like, okay, I understand what you mean, because
make it relevant, bro.
Yeah. But I'm also like, don't you just think it's good to read the Bible well on its own terms, and that's its own good? I just think that's good. So there's that. And then in terms of specifics, yeah, I mean, it means that I'm comfortable going to Torah for instruction, as both it's meant to be, but also as Paul describes it, right? Everything that was written in our past was for our instruction, etc. So I'm comfortable with that. And then, of course, yeah, if you want to get super practical, when I was in Scotland, I didn't eat blood pudding for this reason. Yeah.
For those who don't know,
I assume all listeners of Messiah podcast know, but
there's a dish in Scotland that's called blood pudding. It's literally just dried a block.
Yeah,
of dried
it's not
blood.
a metaphor.
It's really just dried blood, which would, definitely be prohibited by the decree.
Yeah, Acts 15 is
nothing more explicit.
Yeah.
So for me, I mean, just kind of taking a bit of a higher, like a 30,000 foot view, Moses says, "I set before you life and death," because Israel did not have was not granted a heart to know. That's Deuteronomy 29:3. They experienced the commandment as death because they disobeyed it and were exiled and put under, occupation of foreign powers. Or at least this is the narrative of the Tanakh. And Ezekiel comes and prophesies that one day God will put his spirit within his people, take their heart of stone out, give them the heart of flesh. Jeremiah prophesies that God will write the law on their heart. Moses prophesies that God will take them back and circumcise their hearts. And the result of this for Moses and the prophets is that once that supernatural divine act happens by God's graciousness and mercy, that you would finally experience the commandment as life.
Mm-hmm.
And how tragic is it that generations of Christians who have real faith and have encountered the Spirit of God have been inculcated in a kind of ideology that makes them not able to experience the commandments as life.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Which does not mean, not in the sense of the law having the power to resurrect or whatever, that's the job of the Spirit received through faith. But the goal of all the prophetic promises is that finally Israel and now also the Gentiles would walk according to the Torah that proceeds from Zion, right? Isaiah. And it just makes me, it's a really tragic thing that this kind of really kind of contorted ideology makes people unable to. They feel as though the commandments are bad and restrictive and mean and exclusionary, and there's just something that's so sad about that, and surely not helpful for people spiritually. So I mean, one of the things I really care about is in kind of church contexts is trying to help as in whatever kind of small degree I can, help those around me experience the law as like a good thing and instruction. And not that it's like the source of their salvation or whatever, but it is, right? The telos of their salvation is to walk with God according to these commandments. That's what the prophets say, and also the New Testament. So for me personally, I mean, and also on a kind of lower level or a kind of more specific level, one of the things, especially Protestants, kind of lay Protestants have a hard time with is they associate like detailed and complicated legal thinking with like legalism, the Pharisees, right? So like I even read this in a book recently published on the Pharisees that said that what Jesus is angry about in Mark 7 is the fact that they're like the very fact that they are engaging in detailed discussions of these issues. I'm like,
wow,
swapping minutia.
And then that author then goes on to say that Jesus does not enter into halakhic discussion with them, which is wild to me. Jesus is in the business of real. I mean, Mark 2:23-28 is a great example of him pulling from 1 Samuel 21 as a kind of legal exemplar to explain when and how it is prohibited to profane Shabbat, and why he can do so innocently. And there's so many layers of legal assumptions that go into that. It's a very, very complicated legal argument. It's a really good one, but it requires a really detailed understanding of temple law, of Shabbat, of the difference between positive and negative commandments, right? I mean, like it requires a lot of these distinctions, and that knowing that our Lord did that. And he was not just able to do that because he was zapped by God from birth. Like he didn't like pop out of the womb being like, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for Sabbath. Like he himself, took on intellectual limitations of human bodies, of human selfhood. And so therefore he studied Torah with people in his local community. And he came to the convictions that he did through close engagement with these texts. And so if Christians want to follow in the way of the resurrected Lord, of how he taught and how he learned, then it requires going to the sources from which he himself learned as a human being, and being willing to enter into ethical discussion in the same way that he did, I think is a key part of what it means to intellectually love God and love Jesus with all of your mind. So I found it very freeing to actually, when I've been studying this stuff over the past few years, to be like, no, like actually, like getting into the weeds and nitpicking can be like a spirit-filled exercise, and a really good thing for figuring out how to love God and neighbor. And whereas I think people just assume that lay Protestants often assume in my context that like even kind of entering into these discussions is just like hindering in the first place.
Right. It's pharisaical.
Jesus
right?
didn't care about.
That's the
it's pharisaical, right?
Yeah.
Entering into the detailed discussions, right? Because Jesus says, why do you even care about tithing dill, mint, and cumin, right?
My most favorite.
No, he doesn't say that, right? This is so this is what I call the impossible challenge of Protestants read Matthew 23:23, which is like whenever you see a Protestant cite or quote Matthew 23:23, they always think that Jesus is condemning the Pharisees for tithing dill, mint, and cumin, which is deeply ironic.
Given that he's commending them for their tithing.
He follow up? He follows
these
it up.
You
with,
should have done
this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, these you should have done without neglecting the others.
You neglect the weightier things, love, justice, mercy. These things you ought to have done without leaving undone the others, or something to that effect. Yeah, and it's quite literally, great job. You should have done both, though. And so you get there. The great point, right? There's things that are weightier, etc., but things being weighty does not come at the expense of what we might call sort of minutia or something like that. And yet, because of, this is to tack on to what Logan was saying, because of this a trained pattern of interpretation, it will just quite literally lead people to misread at the literal level, misread something that it says, because they just you can't, or obviously at the very least misquote it. But
they can't imagine that Jesus would be interested in
could say that, anyway,
in tithing really small points of grain, and him thinking that Dagon, that it's important to actually parse what Dagon means in Numbers 18, grain, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
Levites can have flavorful food too. They need some of that.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. They need spices. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's really well put. Experiencing the commandment as life, and it reminded me of when I was first getting into this, the academic sources on this viewpoint. And I was reading, I think, Mark Nanos on Romans, and he's like, "Look, Paul says right here that the reason he's doing all this is to bring Gentiles into the obedience of faith. Like, if the Gentiles aren't becoming obedient, then Paul's not satisfied that his mission is complete. It's not just an identity shift, like all these things, not just like, a belief in something. He really needs them to conform to a certain like standard of behavior, and it's just so because what I grew up with, interesting, and with an interesting combination of my dad was Pentecostal, and but my homeschool curriculum was Independent Fundamental Baptist.
Wow!
But
what a combo!
Yeah. But I'm definitely deeply familiar with this deep suspicion of anything like any sort of like, for a Pentecostal, getting into the weeds on exactly what and what is not permissible goes very against the grain of like being spirit led. And you just the Spirit tell you what to do. And then for the Baptists, it's like, what do you mean? We already told you, don't play cards, don't dance. Don't grow a beard. We already told you what the Bible says you should.
Yeah.
Well, it's
interesting to think about if. Go ahead.
It's just deeply ironic that also we'll make these judgments about Jews or Pharisees in the first century, but then have sort of like modesty discourse debates, about what can be worn and what can't be worn, etc. Or any other kind of debate about what's permissible at a certain time, or like you think about church calendar rules, like what kind of vestments have to be worn when, etc. My point is that, okay, those aren't meaningless. It's good to be led with wisdom and have like rules aren't bad, but it's just deeply ironic that we will comfortably do them, as we as Christians of all stripes will do them, but then see sort of a minutia debate in the Gospels and think, oh, classic Pharisees, just being the bad guys, and you're like, okay,
it's like the most uncharitable read possible. Precisely, right? It's like
most uncharitable read.
When Boltman looks at anything the Pharisees dispute, it's like, oh, stupid petty legalist. But then when like Jesus does something that's quite formally similar, it's like, oh yeah, like caring about the heart.
This is authentic.
Like,
it'd
be interesting to think about what would it look like to like have a theology of the Spirit, a pneumatology, wherein people talk about that the Spirit empowered Jesus to like have really specific legal debates, and like and empowered him to be really sharp on his halakha.
Yeah, that's right.
That's something I've never read in a theology textbook.
Maybe someone should write that theology textbook.
Yeah.
Yeah,
invitation to someone to write it.
Yeah. Well, that's something that I've thought about, because I tell you, today, growing up with this like as a homeschooler, I took systematic theology in high school. I took it again as an undergrad, and then again in seminary. So I'm acutely aware from the theology, not so much from the biblical studies perspective, or not only from that perspective, but from like the theology building perspective. When you start tweaking knobs over here, like what does that mean? What does that mean for our pneumatology? What does that mean for our hamartiology or whatever other? They're all connected, and so someone is going to have to write a Messianic Jewish systematic theology. I think it's probably going to be Richard Harvey, but I don't think I'll get to it first. That's for sure.
What would it also look like? I mean, this is like, again, going back to the personal issues for me, but like also like, what would it look like to do Christian ethics like within the kind of like Jesus, Pharisees, rabbinic kind of tradition? Like to really,
what does Christian Musar look like?
Really derive from close readings of the Torah what is required of Gentiles, Jews, etc., and to think robustly about those things. And I think, to go back to what you said at the beginning, like the particularity of of Israel, the particularity of the Torah, in my experience, for most Christian ethicists, is a problem to be overcome.
Mm-hmm.
And even for some Jewish philosophical ethicists, in my experience, that it's something that you have to deal with. It's not something that can be a kind of foundation, because the Torah, of course, is limited, and it's, ethics can't be limited. It has to be, universal. And so I think these kinds of dichotomies are something that Christian theologians and lay Christians it was really long overdue to overcome them.
Yeah. I love Musar, because I do feel like that was a lacuna growing up with the sort of stuff that I learned in the Baptist homeschool curriculum, because there was just to avoid being legalistic. But I recently reread Paths of the Just, and I have Ways of the Tzaddikim, or Chut Tzaddikim, on my desk right now, and just like I try to stay in that, because I find it really valuable. Like because it's to survey the breadth of Jewish literature and talk about, like, well, here's the better person you can be, and here's the danger of these character traits if you don't eradicate the bad ones, and here's how good the good ones are. And it's like, that's the sort of thing that I find really helpful, and as a frequent reminder.
And it doesn't need to be a kind of antithesis to the work of the Spirit, because that's what the Spirit helps people do. It helps people
learn what the will of God is.
Learn the will of God and actually practically enact that in practice, which needs to be formed by discipline, because we still live in mortal bodies which are susceptible to the vulnerability of and weakness of sin. Yeah.
So this is a question for you, Dr. Sloan. What can you tell us about, because you mentioned you have a book coming out about this in August 2025, Jesus and the Law of Moses, the Gospels, and the Restoration of Israel within first century Judaism. I would certainly like to go pick myself up a copy of that. But can you whet our appetite a little bit? What can we expect to find in this book?
Great. Well, thanks for asking about it. I appreciate that. It'll be out in August. What you can expect is, a little chapter sort of introducing Torah on its own terms, within Tanakh, not necessarily within sort of Second Temple Judaism or Rabbinic literature. And sort of just doing some myth busting, typical, here's a view that it's about, whatever, legalism. Here's a view that it's about whatever, compassionless exclusivism, and let's show how those don't quite work. And then I've got a section sort of doing some engaging secondary scholarship on it, some of which I already mentioned, so I won't rehearse that. But the notion that over the last few decades that certain pockets have said, okay, well, it's legalism, but then Sanders corrected that. And then another pocket said, okay, yeah, it's not legalism, but it is nationalism, and that's what Jesus' problem is. And so then I I argue against that.
James does.
Well, yes, you said it, and a few others. But then, and then the notion that sort of purity is sort of compassionless exclusivism, that sort of idea. That'd be Marcus Borg. And sort of just highlighting those and then describing what I take to be their errors, and then giving a positive view, which is that, and then the next couple of chapters sort of try to describe at the basic level my positive view, which is that, okay, here's the shape of restoration eschatology according to like Deuteronomy 28-30, the notion that Israel will, get the law, break the law, go into exile, etc. But then when they return with all their heart and mind, etc., then, God will restore them from captivity, give them the new hearts, they'll obey the law, all that sort of stuff. And so I kind of survey that in both Torah, prophets, and Second Temple Judaism, to then situate the Gospels as sort of an expression of that restoration eschatology, depicting Jesus as the herald and executor of this national restoration. And then the next chapters give my sort of positive description of Jesus's instruction in Torah. So then I focus on Matthew 5. And then other chapters, I give descriptions and interpretations of what I would call like sort of the intramural disputes, right? So when he has disputes with the Pharisees over XYZ, ritual purity or Shabbat or whatever else. And then the final, or actually, the penultimate chapter interprets his temple action and what all that is about, and then also interprets his crucifixion within sort of the restoration eschatology that I've tried to describe throughout the book. And so it depicts a Jesus who is obviously, won't be surprising at this point, pro-Torah, keeps Torah, expects his disciples to keep Torah, and that was a feature and facet of the restoration. And along the way, I kind of show, okay, here's why the Pharisees got there. So yeah, one point is you can expect a sympathetic reading, or at least a charitable representation of the Pharisees on their own terms. So that I'm depicting Jesus as someone who he'll disagree with the Pharisees, but here's how the Pharisees came to that ruling. And okay, Jesus thinks it's wrong, and I'll side with Jesus. But here, the Pharisees weren't just sort of being willfully evil here when they came up with this ruling or whatever, Yeah, there's that. And then the concluding chapter is really it's sort of a gesture for how this works in other New Testament texts. So got, a couple thousand words on Acts, a couple thousand on Paul, that sort of thing. So how some of it works.
Great.
Yeah. No, I'm excited about it.
Yeah, looking forward to putting it there on the shelf behind me. Let's see, Sloan is going to be after Sanders and after Sandmel, but before Brian Tucker.
Yeah, just before Matt Thiessen as well. Not in not in capacity, but only in alphabetics. But I just noticed that when I started loading my bookshelf, I ended up being right next to Matt Thiessen. I was like, oh, that's cool. If you don't, I assume your readers will know his work. If they don't, they ought to read Jesus and the Forces of Death by Matt Thiessen.
It's a good one.
It's made quite a splash, let me tell you. It's made quite a splash. I think it's influenced a lot of the people that we've interviewed here on the podcast. I feel like Jen Rosner might be it as well.
Definitely, yeah.
And certainly Dr. Matthew Novenson.
Yep.
So this question is just for you, Dr. Williams. We've read some of your papers on this wonderful paper on Mark that talks about the Jesus and what he's saying about the dietary laws in that famous passage translated, declaring all foods clean. And is there, where is your research taking you next? Like, what are you in your capacity as a researcher? What are you looking at now? What can we expect to see in the future?
Yeah. So what's funny is that that kind of question about Mark 7 is what got me into gospel scholarship in the first place.
Oh, yeah.
And it was really just like, I was just reading Mark one day and I thought, there's no way the translations are right about this. Like, what is going on?
Yeah.
And then it just 2 years of basically just slowly kind of developing what I thought about it. And then finally that's out. And what I realized is that when I presented this paper at various places before it was published, I had so many people asking me like, well, what does this mean about, when Jesus says what comes out defiles, or what do you think about the Corban dispute, or what about Jesus's discussion with the Pharisees elsewhere? And I realized what I really need to do is basically do a book following on from that deals with all of Mark 7 more thoroughly in its ancient Jewish context, making serious use of rabbinic literature.
Nice.
And as well as kind of broadening out some of the disputes between Jesus and the Pharisees and Mark, talking about those things more generally. So I am working on a book, a short-ish book-length treatment of Jesus and the Pharisees, focused on Mark, but also looking at how Jesus' criticisms of the Pharisees align with other kinds of criticisms that we find in Josephus, Qumran, the Mishnah, and elsewhere. That hopefully will be done in the next year and a half or so.
Nice. Well, I'm looking forward to having that on my shelf in between Westerholm and N.T. Wright there. That's good.
Oh god, yeah, I never thought W's, right? Yeah. It'll be way after and way below Sloan and Thiessen and Sanders for sure. But
yeah.
But hopefully it makes the shelf.
You're there. You're before Visegrad,
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
you're before Zetterholm, but that's not saying much. He's bringing up the under the train.
Yeah,
I love Zetterholm. Yeah. I love Zetterholm. He was one. Formation of Christianity in Antioch was one of the first full-length scholarly monographs I read. That was just about let's dive into this thing and take take this post a new perspective on Paul perspective, and the CFR gets us. Really fascinating stuff. Well, that's about all the time we have for this podcast. But I just want to say thank you so much to Dr. Sloan and Dr. Williams for coming on the podcast here. It's great to have some people I feel are really kindred spirits in seeing the Jewishness of the New Testament and who are doing this great academic work and representing the view well in a scholarly and intelligent way. So just thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Jacob. Thanks for inviting us, and and thanks for your very good questions.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. It's been fun to be on.
Oh, it's been fun. The fun is all on this side of the table, let me tell you. Well, thanks for joining us today on Messiah Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review along with a 5-star rating. If you want to learn more about the Jewish Jesus, create a free account at ffoz.org and dive into the scriptures from a Messianic Jewish perspective. You'll also receive a free book. Messiah Podcast is made possible by the generosity of our First Fruits of Zion friends. FFOZ friends are people like you who partner in our mission to reconcile disciples of Yeshua with God's prophetic promises to Israel. Tune in next time for more great conversations. Until then, I'm Jacob Franzak. Shalom.
Let his word cover you and me, like the waters cover the sea. Let his love cover you and me, like the waters cover the sea.